Now, she was born on the 21st of March, 1994. During that time, formal legislation, apartheid legislation, had been dismantled or had been abolished. But there were informal practices that were still going on that were pretty much continuing the system of racial segregation. Okay? So, my mother, this lovely white lady, arrives at Home Affairs. Okay? Home Affairs is the Social Security office to register my sister. Okay? She gets to a square building with 4 entrances. Okay? And in the middle is a window. So we have the Indian entrance, we have the black entrance, and we have the colored entrance. Okay? And the first institution, so this is an institution, right? This is an institution called Home Affairs. Okay, this is where you would get your social security number, your ID number, this kind of place, right? And the first institution she comes into are the police, right? So she gets stopped by a police officer who takes a pencil and he sticks it in your hair. And if it sticks, you're a person of color. So now you're either going to go through the colored, Indian, or black entrance, right? If it doesn't stick, you might be an Indian, you might be a white person, right? Okay, so then he'll ask you questions like, where do you live? What's your father's name? Like, where are your ancestors from? And these kind of questions are determining what racial group you belong to. So the pencil in South Africa is more than just a stationary item, right? It's an item of power. It's an item that determines what entrance you get into, right? Of course, the white entrance, maybe this might be the white section, has a lovely couch, maybe 3 people at the counter, right? You might have someone on these other ends, maybe not, all right? My mother had an option of only choosing an English name for my sister, even if that wasn't her name, right? She's named Melissa, but she could have been named Siyakuza, Ngagaza, anything like that in line with her culture. But the lady at the office, even though the legislation denied her the ability to discriminate against my sister, my mother had to give my sister to this colored woman to take her into the colored entrance and then talk to them from inside, right? About, this is my child, this is her name, I promise, I'm with her. And so these kind of discussions about this tension between formal and informal legislation is really quite an interesting way to think about how events begin to shape the way we understand the world, okay? And so I was privileged enough to be, privileged is a term we're going to use quite a lot. I was actually privileged enough to be part of the education policy formation in a transforming South Africa, right? So this is in 1994, when this was quite prevalent. But fast forward to 2014, 20 years, a lot of this informal, sedimentary stuff from the formal legislation of apartheid has continued to remain normal in our society, okay? And so what I began doing was we could analyze these different sections from the lens of class. We could analyze it from the lens of sexual orientation. We could analyze it from the lens of ethnicity. And we could also analyze it from the lens of race. And so for me, because it's appropriate to think about my life experiences and the kind of symbols and institutions, what this talk will be about is looking at the role race and racism has played in this tension, the formal policies and the informal policies. So that's really the context from which I'm going to be talking about, the lens through which I'm going to be talking about, okay? So that's just to give us a brief way of thinking about it. So my talk today is entitled People, Policy, and Power, reflecting on how privilege impacted policymaking within a transforming South Africa. I was a teacher. I qualified to become a teacher, and I taught in a former Bantu school. We had different educational systems according to race. Okay, we had what was known as Bantu, which was reserved for the black African population, where an average of 20 US cents was spent per child on a black child's education, compared to up to $200 per white child's education, right? So we had this differentiated system that continues to sort of, even though the funding is equalized, there's still, we had, for example, the first high schools for black African students were only built in 1976 in South Africa, right? And there were 4 classrooms for every 3,000 families, all right? So the infrastructure backlog and all these policy issues begin to emerge. Okay, so what this is really going to begin to do is embed how my lens and the way I looked at these things and the way I've experienced this transition comes forward. Okay, great. So this is just a graphic of the legacy of apartheid. Just to give you an idea of, I came to the Bush School, and for my internship I was hired within the Office of the Presidency writing the National Development Plan, which is a policy document. This was the end product. And what it did was it maps out a 20-year vision for the country in different fields: education, business, healthcare, and the like, right? So I was part of a policy process that began to really understand the context of South Africa and put forward policy recommendations to begin to address some of these disparities. And these were put into a document that was then adopted in legislation, okay? And this was the context in which we were operating from, right? This graph, what it basically talks to you about is access for different groups to university. This gives you an example of the educational disparities. These two pictures, I've included them to juxtapose the reality. These were taken in 2010 in our country, right? And this is Verwoerd, who is the architect of apartheid. He was one of the first prime ministers. And he was really the brainchild, as it will, of apartheid educational policy, okay? And finally, this is just land allocation. Notice that 13% of land was allocated to basically 87% of the population, whereas white South Africans were allocated 87% of the land, even though they only made up 4.5 million of the population. Okay. With all this background, what was the policy problem that we were tasked with dealing with? And some would call it dropout, others would call it retention. But the key policy problem that we were tasked with over the 12 weeks was to understand why students were dropping out at such a high rate. Okay? So, just to give you an idea, I'm going to walk you through this graphic. 45.8% of the students that drop out, 48.5% of students drop out of school. So we have 1.2 million students in grade 1, and only 564,000 of those students make it to the 12th grade. Okay? Then, of those who make it, 63.5% get the equivalent of, they pass to get the equivalent of a GED. Okay? Then, out of that group, 16% of that group, of 58,000, gain access to college. Of that, 40% drop out in their first year. Okay? And finally, an average of 45% of the graduates look like me from college, right? Out of the learners, 1.2 million that begin. Okay? So even in 2011, these statistics were taken from, if I just want to make sure, 2011. Even in 2011, these racial disparities in our country are still very much with us. They're very much the same. If I showed you under apartheid, it would probably be about 60 or 70 or 80% of the students would be looking like me, right? And so here's an example of, just to juxtapose that with the racial makeup of our country. 79.4% of our 55 million population is black, and only 9.2% of that population is white. All right, and then we have the other groups. So, and that is, once again, as I'm going back to this, that is why talking about race in South Africa is so important, because these glaring inequalities are very important to understand in the policy-making process. Okay. So how did we attack this problem? All right. If Dr. Cortez was here, I would have a shout out for the use of BARDOC, all right, and the eightfold process. Or we use a systematic process. We began with conducting a literature review, designing surveys, collecting data, analyzing them, summarizing, making recommendations. Putting another way, we attacked it in this way. We defined the problem, assembled evidence, and I'm sure many MPSA students will know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. We began to really look at this policy problem from the lens of literature. What can the literature tell us, okay? What can we do in terms of providing surveys, designing surveys, collecting data, running the analysis, looking at the regression, looking at the statistical significance, and making recommendations, okay? Now, throughout this process, I began to keep a journal, right? I began to keep a journal. And so this is a shout out to Dr. Bearfield's Highfoots and Laurie. I began to think about revisiting this process, right? So while I went through that policy analysis process, I was keeping a journal of not only my organizational, but also my policy-making experience. And going back to it, I began to think about this framework, right? So going back to it, 2014, 2015, looking at my journal, taking out my iPad, this picture was just like, I have this journal of this time I was doing policy, and Christina's asking me to go and have a look at this. Let me go back and see what comes out, right? And what I found was, by getting on the balcony and revisiting my journal, I began to see adaptive challenges. I began to see conflicts. I began to see things that I hadn't seen before, right? I began to think about how I was engaged in the policy-making process, but not only that, how I was framing my interactions with my organization and my fellow South Africans and my fellow policy analysts around me. And so what I want to talk about is how I began. This is an example of some of the clues that began to emerge when I coded my journal, right? The policy clues, for example. I came to statistically significant outcomes that shape policy recommendations, but I failed to account for intergroup differences, right? In my mind, a black South African was a black South African was a black South African, right? A white South African was a white South African was a white South African, okay? So what did I mean when I said the word black South African? These are the kind of the things that I was coming into, right? They were a homogenous group, and I was putting them in the same category as someone who was poor, right? When I went back and I thought about the way I was framing people, when I thought about white South Africans, I thought about myself. I didn't think of the diversity that we have in our country. I was using myself as the sort of metric. And then I was evaluating people of color, and then I was evaluating other white people, right? So these were some of the things that came out in my journal. The second thing is in the organization, right? If policy was about regulating and distributing power, how was power operating within my own organization? Where was I? Was I just this neutral policy analyst? How was I influencing group dynamics? So these are the sort of questions that I began to ask myself. Okay, so this has got quite a lot of things on it. But seeing conflicts as clues wasn't enough for me. I needed another framework to begin to understand how racism may have been a factor in the way that I was thinking about things, right? So I adopted a model created by Peggy McIntosh, okay? And I'll first begin to explain to you what privilege is, and then I'll begin to talk about what white privilege is. And then I'll begin to talk about my list that I've handed out to you. Okay. So let me make it very, very clear the way I understand privilege. The best way for me to describe it is, imagine I'm going to a building. I'm walking into a building. But before I go in, I have two friends with me. One person in a wheelchair and one person who might be transgendered. Okay? Now, I walk up the stairs, I open the door, I walk in, I go to the counter, I do my transaction, and I'm just resting against the counter, right? I'm just resting while we conduct the transaction. And then on my way out, I use the male restroom. Okay? Now, when it comes to my colleague in a wheelchair, they're having a totally different experience alongside me, right? They're thinking to themselves, is there a wheelchair ramp? If I get up there, is there someone to open the door? Is there a way I can open the door? If I get in, will the counter be high enough for them to see me? And if I need to use the restroom, will there be support systems for me to use the restroom? Or will I have to wait till later, right? Now my transgender friend, the other one, might not have the same problems or the same challenges as me or my friend in a wheelchair. But they may think about things like, so when I go inside, how are people going to respond to me? If I go to the counter, will I have to reveal my transgender identity or not? Right? And if I use the bathroom, which bathroom do I use? And will people in the bathroom be sensitive to me, or will I be in danger? Okay? Now let's put it another way. Let's just think about Northgate. And I'm in a bar, right? I'm in a bar with women. When I need the restroom, I go to the restroom. When ladies go to the restroom, they go in packs. Right? So there's this thought process that doesn't enter my mind, right? Because the bar is not an unsafe place for me. The building is not something that I even think about navigating, right? Because I have some kind of privileges that people alongside me do not have, right? So privilege is sort of a way in which what we think about is normal is not normal for everyone. People are engaging the world in a different way. They're engaging the building, they're engaging the bar, they're thinking about themselves. They're interacting with people in a different way. So that's what privilege is, right? And there's different forms of privilege. There's class privilege, there's sexual orientation, there's all kinds of privileges, right, that interact. In fact, talking about privilege, being a white person who has privilege is a form of privilege, right? So just to put that forward. Being a person of color up here talking about privilege would likely have a different response. But we'll get a bit more into that in a moment. So what Peggy McIntosh does is she begins to talk about this idea of white privilege, okay? Diffusing this idea of overt racial discrimination and beginning to think about what kind of, if the building feels differently for people of color, what does that look like, right? What does that mean? And for me, my thought was, if the system of apartheid was built to benefit people that look like me, and many of my experiences growing up in a post-apartheid South Africa with a sister of color in my family, then surely there's a form of white South African privilege that we have that may not be the same as privilege anywhere else. But if there's still remnants of apartheid in the society that I live that benefits me, then surely I may have white privileges that I may not even realize that I do have. So I began to construct this list. And that's what you see in front of you. It's a list of 50 things, right? And you will notice that the list is things that may be totally out of your context. But I began to reflect upon, what does it mean? What is my normal? And what does the building look like to me? What are the kind of questions I'm not asking? What are the kind of things that I'm taking for granted in my environment, right? And so these sort of things began to emerge. And this process was very difficult because the first thing I started to do was diminish, deny, and deflect my involvement, right? I am a good person. I am not involved in a racist, white privilege system in South Africa. No, I'm a good person. People like me and I like them, right? So I used this idea of a good person to, when I first started writing this, the list was kind of juxtaposed to my feelings of who I was. But what I began to realize as I was going through this process was that I was trained in many ways to live like this, right? For example, in 2014, 53% of white South Africans believed that apartheid was not a crime against humanity, that apartheid wasn't really that bad, right? Compared to 80% of black South Africans, 77% of Indians, and 70% of colored citizens, right? So I asked myself, with this disparity, how much have I been socialized to deflect, deny, or diminish reality in South Africa, right? Okay. So what I learned was that even when racism is obvious, myself included, white South Africans still struggle to recognize it. Even when things are overt, there's still this sense of like, no, this isn't really, no, I don't think so, right? There's still this sort of behavior that goes on, okay? And so I began to really deconstruct what that means for me. So I'm bringing us back to the policy process. And I've taken some privileges on the side over here. I wasn't able to put the numbers in just before, so they do appear on this list, but I just took 4 out for us, okay? So for those who may, let me just read the first one. There is likely to be a private or former Model C school. Model C school is a school previously reserved for white South Africans only, okay? Regardless of class, the terms underprivileged, disadvantaged, or landless are not used as synonyms for my race, okay? I'm able to choose a school that will likely teach my home language as a first or very least second language. We have 11 official languages in South Africa, which is the reason why I put this on, that even though we have 11, people want to speak English, or they will speak Afrikaans. And I can remain oblivious to the language and customs of persons of color who constitute the world's majority without feeling in my culture any penalty for such oblivion. This is where my list begins to overlap with Macintosh. Okay, now, what is this bringing me back to the education policy process, right? Going back into my journal, thinking about these environments, thinking about these things, and asking myself, so how does this become operationalized in the way that I think about policy? Or how was it operationalized? So when we think about the racial underpinnings of each one, when I think about access, right? When I think about where the quote-unquote good schools are and how far they are geographically from me, and I think about the fact that in South Africa, the average commuting time for a person of color is 1.5 hours or 3 hours a day to a school or to a place of business or their job, right? I think about how I think about schools. When I think about schools, I think about me just hopping outside 10 minutes before school starting and going to school, right? That's how I materialize and frame schooling. And that comes from my privilege, right? It comes from this idea that all schools have toilets, all schools have running water, all schools have electricity, right? So this assumption about infrastructure. When I think about the way we frame, with the way I was framing people of color in terms of their class, their racial constructs of different people. So this idea that, yeah, we can just talk about underprivileged people and we know exactly who we're talking about, right? Or we can just talk about poor people and we know exactly who we're talking about, right? And if we were talking about white South Africans, it would be poor whites, right? Because those are like a class by themselves. But when you're talking about poor, it's black South Africans, right? Okay. When we think about home language, we think about curriculum policy. We think about instruction, language of instruction. And then when I think about culture, I think about colorblindness, about this culture of colorblindness that's beginning to emerge in South Africa, right? As a counter-narrative to the reality of the disparities that we're seeing, okay? Now, what are the implications of this for the way in which we recommended policy at the time? Curriculum and pedagogy, what students are learning about their own history, about their own culture, right? School language policy, the way in which people of color and other people who are in elite positions are able to dominate language policies for schools, right? So there's class also happening here. And then finally, a rhetoric of equality without inclusive school practices. So schools became very good at saying, we're an inclusive environment, here are our policies, right? We're a great environment. This is the way we do things here. When you come, you'll see college-level classes, but if you dig deep, you realize that that's actually the lowest level classes that you will find. But they're college level. So if you're not digging deeper, you're not finding the truth, right? And so these are sort of how my privileges, as I understand them, began to really impact the way I was thinking about policy. Okay. So let's talk about what does understanding privilege mean for policymakers, public managers, international relations, wherever you go. I think that what privilege does is it reveals positionality. It reveals that you are not a neutral person in a neutral place at a neutral time. Who you are embodies power, okay? And it can be geographic power. For example, one of the things I learned about creating a list about my own white privileges is that many white South Africans would come to me and say, but that doesn't apply to me. I don't have that experience. But one thing I would say to them is that, yes, you may, for example, not be called boss, which means boss, right? Which is something that I've experienced a lot. But you may be thought of being an expert without ever opening your mouth, right? So you may not have the same privileges I have in the same country, but you still have this commonality of white privilege, okay? Talking about geography even more. As I was reflecting on my time here in the US, I thought about having the night a friend calls me, African-American friend calls me, I invited him to my house. He says to me, Warren, please meet me at the bus stop. It's 6 p.m. And I'm thinking to myself, why, right? And so I meet him at the bus stop, we're walking, and I'm sort of saying, I was cooking, and you asked me to come, I don't understand. He says, well, I was scared to be racially profiled on my way home, on the way to your house, right? So what that made me realize is that even though I'm not a citizen of the US, I have certain privileges that are operating for me without me even realizing it, right? I don't even think about being racially profiled in my own neighborhood, right? So this idea of geography is a very important thing. He was terrified. He needed me to be with him so that there was less of a chance of us getting stopped, okay? Secondly, culturally sensitive research can lead to more effective policymaking, implementing, and evaluating. When I go back and I evaluate those policies that we recommended, because we didn't use a culturally sensitive lens, I kind of have some retrospective insight into why we're facing some of the challenges that we may be facing in terms of implementation, okay? And then finally, another shout out to our jurists. Double loop learning or reflexive learning can provide insights into anticipating, managing, and assessing change. Change is hard, right? But this reflective and reflexive process, my first go at policymaking was a single loop learning process, both in terms of the way I approached organizations and the way that I approached policies. But going back and really thinking about this in terms of, why did this happen? Was that person just a bad person? Was that person just someone I didn't like? Or was that person someone who didn't like me? But thinking about it through this lens of double loop learning and understanding my own positionality brought a whole new perspective to the data that just kind of opened me up to a new understanding of policy making, and organizations. So what are the takeaways, all right? I've kept on re-emphasizing this. Policies, you are not neutral individuals. You exist in power and in power relations with different people. You exert power, you take power away, okay? Secondly, frameworks such as privilege help to unmask covert power relations, okay? This idea of normal is both an overt and a covert thing happening at the same time, all right? And what this helped me do in terms of looking at privilege is talking about how apartheid was more than just formal legislation. It was more than just laws. It was a way of life. It seeped into everything that we do, right? It seeped into the way we interact with each other. It seeped into the way we think. It seeped into the way we engage with people, right? And our normal is actually abnormal in many ways, right? So we're creating normal policies in an abnormal environment. So we require double loop learning, reflexive thinking, to try and mesh the two together, to try and thread them together, okay? And in order to do that, we have to understand culture. We have to understand culture in research and policy making, all right? In order to make that jump, we have to understand the people we're dealing with, and they have to understand us. And that requires collaboration. It requires us actually giving people what they want rather than what we think they need, all right? And then finally, I think the critical thing that I'd like you to take away is that white privilege is a system. Often we speak about racism as if it's micro interactions. I hate you, you hate me, those sort of things. But what I've learned is that white privilege is really, because it's a combination of all these things, they reinforce each other in many ways, right? So when we're writing policy in environments like this, where we're dealing with things like the police, when we're dealing with home affairs, these are real people who experience life in a real way, right? Who experience 6 p.m. walking in Warren's neighborhood in a different way to me, who might be writing the policy for that individual, right? And so for me, in order to tackle the system of white privilege in South Africa, it requires a balance of both project and process. It requires understanding the resource practicalities in terms of understanding efficiency, economic efficiency in terms of cost-benefit analysis, all these really important policy analysis tools. But it also requires us understanding the organizations within which we work and the organizational structures of the context within which we are working, right? When we think of Bowman and Deal's symbolic human resource frames, right? these kind of processes are very critical, not only in the places that we work, because they are microcosms of South Africa, right? Or the US or wherever, but the communities as well. Okay. So given all of that, I think my time might be up. I'd like to ask for some questions. This is the lovely Peggy McIntosh. She was different to what I expected her to look like, so I took a picture with her. And I do have references at the end for anyone who's also interested. I'll post those up right at the end, but I'd love to open up the space for questions, discussion, and the like. Thank you for your time, firstly. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, in your experience since studying here, have you noticed that there's a radical departure between white South African privilege and just white American privilege?
Okay, so from what I understand, you're asking me whether there's a huge distinction, right? I would say in many ways, the rhetoric is different, right? In South Africa, it's like you're made very aware that there's a racial disparity here. Whereas in the US, it's not always overt, right? It sort of operates in like in terms of police, walking at 6 p.m. at night, that's something that never occurred to me. So there could be, right? There could be, and many scholars such as McIntosh and people have written about it. But in terms of my own understanding, I don't think I've been here long enough to get my pulse on the obvious nature, because I might be looking at it through my own framework. Because in South Africa, it's very obvious. By 6 p.m., everyone is in their neighborhoods, and everyone in their neighborhoods looks like everyone in the neighborhood, right? Whereas here, it operates differently. So for me, as I can say, in terms of my own understanding, there's definitely something there. In order for me to describe it and get language for it, I don't think I'm in the right place just yet. But there's something there, definitely. I just need to put my finger on it. So I hope I get to part of your question. I'm not sidestepping it. I just don't know. Okay. Yes, more questions, please. Goodness, I hope I didn't scare people. All right, we'll take you, Breanna, then you, Chris. Let's get one more person.
You mentioned the informal, that's what I'm looking for, informal roadblocks that contribute to this segregation in South African society. Yes. I'm curious, those informal things are a lot harder to quantify, as you mentioned, those formal, obvious things. So when it comes to the policy process, typically how responsive are people to when you bring up these informal roadblocks that may potentially hinder the policy process?
Yes, it's a tough job. It's a tough job because not only is it identifying them, it's identifying the influence that they have, right? It's not just about saying, yes, I think that person looks like a powerful person, but you don't know, maybe that person actually has a husband that is actually influencing it, right? So you're not actually looking at the right person, even though that person might be someone who appears to you as the influencer, right? So I think for me, the first step, at least, as I said, for myself, and I know this has been a lot about me, so I apologize for many people that might not necessarily be appropriate. But I think understanding processes through people's own lens can add value, right? Okay, so to get to your question, I think part of it is understanding our own biases. I think looking at privilege really helped me do is to understand that policies are not just things out there, they actually become part of my life and learned in such a normalized way that I do not think about them. I do not think about driving on the right-hand side of the road in the US. I do not think about stopping at a stop street or letting someone cross the street, right? I don't think about those things. And so for me, what I tried to do was, by looking at those privileges, I began to connect them to other people's experiences, right? And they helped me highlight the influential people on my life. And what we started doing is, what I'd like to do next time I'm in a team, is for people to deconstruct a little bit more about where their positions are, so that we can see our blind spots, okay? So getting back to what you were saying about, informal, the influence it has, it's definitely there. And I think there are frameworks that we can use to get to them. Privilege for me is definitely one of these frameworks we can use to begin to get an idea of where things are. And then only after that can we make decisions about who, where, what, how, and to what extent. Yeah. Dr. Taylor, I'm coming to you then. Dr. Taylor, yes.
So you went back to your journal, you thought reflexively, and did some double loop learning about the policy recommendations that you had supported during your internship. What would you have done differently? during your internship had you been more reflective at that time?
Goodness, that's a great question. I think what I would have done very much differently is looked at the group of people. So I want to make sure I see you, Dr. Taylor. Looked at the group of people I was working with, because one thing I realized was that putting me in charge was not necessarily what was healthy for the organization. Right? Because I was able to take everyone's perspective and shape them through my own lens, through recommendations. So that's the first thing. I would have looked at my organization better and made some adjustments. The second thing I would have done is I would have gone back to the community with a different instrument to collect the data. And I would have interviewed a different population. Because what I found was that I went there and said, who's running this place? All right, we'll sit down and we'll interview you, thank you, and then left, right? Because I thought to myself, well, this is sort of like my community. You go to the local neighborhood watch, you find the person who's on the top and you interview them, and then they will implement it. So for me, those are the two things. I would have changed the way in which my organization was running. And secondly, I would have changed the population and the way we collected the data using the instrument that we had. Because it was very much me saying, this is the best instrument for the literature. For this context, well, we're just going to apply it to our context. And I think there might have been some space there that we may have lost some stuff in the process. So thank you. Ms. Breanna?
I wanted to ask a little more about your sister and
Yes.
her experience being adopted into your family.
Yes.
As in, did she feel like her privilege rose because maybe
Mhm.
she had access to, say, better schooling, or was she always kind of viewed by society as an outsider or question?
It depends, right? So on the one hand, being a child of color in a white household is like, hitting the lottery, right? And I mean that in the most respectful, humblest way. Because, for example, she has been able to access the best schools in the country. She speaks English with an English accent. There's sort of this, by extension, people treat her as if she's a white child. Okay, because she knows no African language. She just looks different, right? But that doesn't mean that her experiences have been the same as a white child. For example, I'll give you some insight. We would arrive at people's houses, and we would find ourselves eating in the kitchen. The kids' table would be moved to the kitchen, and you would turn over your plate, and you would see a mark on the bottom of the plate. Well, that's the plate that people of color are supposed to eat off, because we don't serve people of color with the cutlery and crockery that we're going to be eating at the main table, right? Or we would get to a place, and they would say things like, yeah, we thought we had a room for 5, but we only have a room for 4, so would the youngest daughter mind sleeping with the staff members at the hotel, right? So it's sort of like, no, but we booked a room for 5. Well, no, I'm sorry, sir, there's been a mistake on our roster, right? Or, for example, we would get to a place and they'd be like, who is that? Who is that? And why is she here? Where's the mother? Where's the mother for this child, right? So in those interactions, you're sort of like, okay, clearly race is playing a role here. And how do I maintain my friendship with this person while still dealing with the discrimination that's obviously emanating? So, and obviously she's not blind. She can sort of pick it up, right? So there's that sort of like double picture that keeps on going on. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's been the evolution since the apartheid system was taken down? What's been the evolution of this informal set of rules? Because, right, we can say, well, 50% of the white people think that apartheid wasn't too bad, but maybe that percentage has just been improving, and there's just a positive trend that, well, maybe people are learning about it, it's just at a slower rate than we would want, and then there will be a different problem, right?
Yes.
So what's been that evolution of the conception of the privilege in South Africa?
Great question. What I should have put on there is to say that the previous survey conducted 2 years earlier showed 70%, right? So it's actually declining. The perspective is actually declining. I should have put that on there. But what that's showing is that over time, the perspective of apartheid being, and people are blaming that on generational things, like people who have never grown up under apartheid are sort of looking back and saying, well, there was nothing really wrong, about any of that, right? So I think there's generational things in there. But from the population group, I could talk a little bit more about the survey. But the population group was pretty much over 3,000 white South Africans across metropolitans, urban areas, rural areas, and the like. So the sample size was quite large. But yet the data is really showing this sort of downward trend. Yeah. All right, are there any other questions? Yes?
I have another question, and it's just like, we talk a lot about privilege in the sense that what's normal for some people say white South Africans isn't normal for other people. Most likely people in class actually want to different technical rotation, just they see race, and within race, black, colored, and Indian. The question I wanted to ask was, I guess in your personal life and in your daily life and just in your research, did you see that like a difference in perception of like just colorism?
Colorism. I've never heard that term before. Can you explain it to me?
Is that okay? I'm African American,
Yes.
and I'm not dark, but I'm fairly dark. I'm fairly darker than maybe a normal African American.
Okay.
Because of that, I might be perceived in a different way, maybe more negative.
Okay, so you're talking about spectrums.
Yeah.
Spectrums of quote-unquote blackness, spectrums of quote-unquote whiteness, yes. Well, that's where the pencil test comes in, right? The one-drop rule in the US,
Right.
for example. Like, the pencil test, you'll see some families in which all the family have their head shaved. They're in a colored community, they look very white, all right? And their heads are always shaved, right? And if you really dig into the history of that, it comes down to this thing, right? You have families where twins, even now, twins in a quote-unquote colored family, where the one is very light and the one is very dark. And if you look at their families and you look at their jobs and you look at their opportunities, it's totally disparate. Totally disparate, right? You'll find that those who are darker are very much in the same boat as black South Africans, I would argue. And the ones who are lighter, or at least in the middle class, they're automatically assumed to be more educated, more, right? Okay. All right, so it looks like you have a question. I'll take last two, and then we'll close up. Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's what we've been committing ourselves to for the last 21 years, right? I mean, that has been at the forefront of our national agenda. Part of me talking to you here is being part of that program, right? Being part of that process. We've definitely made huge strides. We've definitely but there's a long way to go, right? The fact that 45% of the graduates only look like me 20 years later in some ways is progress, right? So in many respects, we have been able to transform what the places look like. The next step is how do we transform the way people interact with each other? How do we transform the way people work with each other? Because that's the next step. Getting us in one room was a huge thing. And many anti-apartheid activists would say, well, at least you have that, right? At least you have the fact that you can sit in the same restaurant. At least the fact that you can sit in the same school building, right? But the next generation, such as myself, is asking, how do we create policies? How do we look at the role these two things are playing to take the next step, which is actual working and actually making things productive, if that makes any sense. I hope I'm sort of touching on your question. Is that all right? Perfect. Yes, ma'am.
So, Lauren, can you speak a little bit more about the intersection between race and class? And
Yes.
it's particularly complex in South Africa, where you have, if I get it right, Afrikaans,
Yes.
white Afrikaans, and then you're also getting a very affluent black class. So how does that intersect?
Okay, brilliant question. I'm glad someone asked that. I was going to dig into that a bit more had I had more sort of realm, so more space. Okay, so the question was, how do we talk about now, for those who may not be familiar, this idea of intersection, right? So how do we talk about this idea of class, this idea of race, and ethnicity, right? Ethnicity, excuse me. And in this sense, we have the Afrikaans group, we have the upper class black South Africans and the like, right? And these are all intersecting. So the question is really about how is this operating, okay? Now, the key thing to understand here for me, and I'll deal with each of these differently. Over here, the Afrikaans group is a white ethnic group, right? I'm of British descent, I'm an ethnic group. Afrikaans people are of a separate ethnic group, right? But we classify it as white, okay? Now, within the white South African population, all right, the wealth, the economic wealth, is very much concentrated in not only the white community, but within small families, within about 50 or so families, right, who cross both the Afrikaans and English spectrum, right? So 90% of the economic wealth in 2011 was still owned by this small, not only the white community, but a small faction of the white community, right? And part of the peace process in South Africa was saying, how do we open up economic opportunities? So they introduced this idea of affirmative action. People have heard about this before. And especially this sense called black economic empowerment, where any company has to, in order for them to get contracts, had to at least have a certain percentage of black South Africans on the boards. So this created a small upper class of elites. Now, black includes white women, right? The term black in South Africa includes white women. The term black was used to include any formerly oppressed group, so it only excluded white males, okay? So when we talk about upper class blacks, we have to ask, okay, who and what and how? I have to ask these really specific questions, okay? But I think your question may be the idea that comes to mind when I first say upper class black, which is black South African, right? Black South African, black African. What we have is a very small elite that are pretty much monopolizing the other 10% of the economy. All right, very small politically elite, okay? And what's happening is we're having a rise of the black middle class, which is, I think as of 2014, surpassed the size of the white middle class. So we're looking at, I think in terms of sheer numbers, I think we're looking at perhaps, I could be mistaken, between 5 and 6 million black African middle class South Africans. So what this is telling us is that this policy has been very, very effective to not only create the racial equality in terms of just political equality, in terms of dignity, but also economic access. But still, a large part of our population is pretty much outside of the economy and outside of the policy realm. For example, over a third of our population is unemployed. 98% of those are young black African males between the ages of 18 and 24. So we're talking almost 3, 4, 5 million young people, right? So when we intersect all these things, what we find is it's complex. What we find is that it's difficult to talk about privilege in isolation, which I've sort of done here. There's more to the story, right? There's a lot more. There's a lot more privilege when it comes to, in fact, literature that's coming out is talking about the class distinction amongst black South Africans and how that's creating difficulties in terms of, intergenerational difficulties, in terms of movement, economic movement, political participation. They're changing political affiliation, for example, from the African National Congress to the Democratic Alliance. So there's a whole lot of features that happen there. It's becoming less racialized. The political landscape is becoming less racialized. But as I said, these are more exceptions rather than the norms. This economic thing is still very much part of our life. I don't think I would be here standing in front of you if I was a different race in South Africa. That's pretty much the reality for many young people. All right, Dr. Bearfield, yes.
One of the fascinating things, and particularly on the notion of privilege and the intersection of class, for many minorities, it is the idea that your privilege is somehow dependent on the approval of whites. And I raised this, I had a blonde guy a couple years ago, white blonde guy, who decided that he wanted to, because I was displaying middle class privilege. I owned my home. He could tell that I was reasonably well educated. thought he was going to start talking to me about Mexicans. No, that's not what's going to happen here. But it was his way of making me feel included. They are not like us. As if he wasn't going to talk about black people when he walked around the corner. Or traveling abroad. I've been racially profiled both in South Africa and in Egypt. With my colleagues, all educators, at both times, well, in Egypt, which was probably the most fascinating, I was having breakfast, and we were having our usual wrap-up, get ready for the day, and I was asked for my room key. And I just kept asking God, why are you asking me? Now, ironically, I was with a white South African, and he went upstairs and read them the riot act. It was the second time I had been stopped. I was the only black person staying in the hotel. So clearly, he didn't know I was American, which would have stopped it. He thought I was an African. And then he thought I was hustling the nice white people who were staying there. And the reason I kept saying, why are you asking? Because I'm letting him know, my privilege is not dependent on what you think of me. You're going to explain to me why you are asking me this question. And so, it's important to understand that privilege is this thing that exists, but how one uses it, what Warren's doing is fascinating. What Warren is using his privilege to illuminate this larger conversation and show, and he can do it in a way where he doesn't feel threatened at all. If you walk out of this room and you are not happy with this talk or saying that he's telling secrets, Warren's privilege is not at all threatened, but he's using it to advance this conversation. Having a minority have this conversation is a very different. And so I think I want to thank you for doing this. He was very generous to do it and talk about South Africa, so you wouldn't have to think about privilege in America.
I wanted to leave you smiling with everyone, right? So.
But it was really important. I want to thank you for doing it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.